not supposed to happen. Not according to the manuals, not according to the strategy, not according to decades of battlefield doctrine that had been built around the idea that these weapons gave Israeli forces an almost unfair advantage over any enemy they would ever face. But Hezbollah did not read those manuals. And what they had prepared in secret across months of careful planning was something that Israel's most advanced intelligence apparatus had failed to fully anticipate. A two-wave attack, coordinated, layered, designed specifically to overwhelm systems that were built to stop exactly this kind of threat. The first wave hit before anyone could react. The second wave hit before anyone could recover. And when the smoke finally began to clear, what the cameras captured was the kind of footage that gets studied in military academies for decades. Not because it showed victory, but because it showed something far more dangerous. It showed vulnerability. This is the story of what actually happened, why it happened, and why the implications stretch far beyond the hills of southern Lebanon into the boardrooms of defense contractors, the war rooms of rival nations, and the strategic calculations of every military power watching this conflict from a safe distance. Stay with this until the end. Because the final piece of this story is the one that almost nobody is talking about. For years, Israel built its battlefield confidence around a core belief. If you had the right equipment, you controlled the outcome. This was not arrogance. It was a lesson earned through war. Through the devastating losses of 1973, when Egyptian and Syrian forces with Soviet-supplied anti-tank missiles tore through Israeli armor in ways that shocked the world. That experience became fuel. It became the engine behind some of the most intensive military research and development programs in modern history. The result was a new generation of weapons. Vehicles and systems that were hardened, layered, and in some cases equipped with active protection technology that could literally intercept incoming rockets and shells before they ever made contact with the vehicle itself. These were not ordinary machines. They were engineering achievements, and for years they performed exactly as promised. But what most people don't realize is that the moment you announce to the world that something is indestructible, you have also just handed your enemy the most powerful motivation they will ever have. Hezbollah understood this better than almost anyone. They had been watching Israeli armor operate in Lebanon since the 1980s. They had studied the 2006 war with a kind of obsessive analytical focus that only comes from knowing your survival depends on it. They had cataloged every engagement, every failure, every near miss. They had reverse-engineered Israeli tactics, consulted with Iranian military engineers, and received weapons transfers that slowly, quietly, shifted the balance of what was possible on that terrain. And through all of it, they kept asking one question. What does it take to break the thing they say cannot be broken? The answer came in stages, and by the time Israeli forces moved into the specific operational zone where the events of that day would unfold, Hezbollah had already rehearsed the answer many times over. Now let's talk about the four weapons at the center of this story, because understanding what these machines were designed to do is the only way to understand why their destruction sent such a powerful signal. The first is the Merkava tank. Not just any tank. The Merkava Mark IV, Israel's most advanced ground combat vehicle, a machine that represented the absolute pinnacle of Israeli armor design philosophy. Unlike most tanks in the world, the Merkava was designed with crew survival as the absolute priority. The engine was placed at the front of the vehicle, creating an additional layer of protection for the soldiers inside. The internal layout was specifically engineered to give crews a better chance of surviving impacts that would kill the occupants of virtually any other armored vehicle on Earth. It also carried the trophy system, an active protection system that had become famous in military circles for its ability to detect, track, and intercept incoming anti-tank missiles and rocket-propelled grenades in the fraction of a second between launch and impact. Trophy had already saved Israeli tank crews multiple times in previous operations in Gaza. It had performed so reliably that it had been adopted by the United States Army for its own Abrams tanks. And yet, on that day, in southern Lebanon, Merkava tanks burned. The second weapon was the Namer armored personnel carrier, another Israeli engineering achievement. The Namer, which means leopard in Hebrew, was built on the same chassis as the Merkava tank, making it one of the most heavily armored personnel carriers in the world. It weighed over 60 tons. It was designed to carry infantry through the most dangerous combat environments imaginable, protect them from small arms fire, from rocket-propelled grenades, from improvised explosive devices, from the full range of threats that modern urban and rural warfare could throw at it. The Namer also carried its own version of active protection systems. It was, by virtually any objective military assessment, one of the most survivable armored vehicles ever built for infantry transport. And yet, on that day, in southern Lebanon, Namers burned too. The third weapon was the D9 armored bulldozer. This is a machine that does not look like a weapon, but functions as one of the most important tools in Israeli ground operations. The D9 is a massive armored caterpillar bulldozer. modified with thick armor plating and ballistic glass, designed to operate directly in combat zones. It clears terrain. It demolishes structures. It creates paths for armor to advance. It has been used in Gaza, in the West Bank, and throughout Lebanon over decades of Israeli military operations. Because of its size and its armor, it was considered extremely difficult to disable with the kind of weapons that Hezbollah typically deployed. Operators had survived engagements that would have been lethal in any other vehicle, and yet, on that day, in southern Lebanon, the D9 stopped moving. The fourth weapon was an armored engineering vehicle, a specialized support machine designed to operate alongside tank units, conducting obstacle clearance and breaching operations under fire. These vehicles are even less glamorous than tanks in the public imagination, but they are absolutely critical to how armored forces advance through defended terrain. Destroying them does not just eliminate a single vehicle, it stops an entire column from being able to move forward safely. 4 machines, representing 4 different layers of Israeli military capability: ground assault power, infantry protection, terrain control, and engineering support. Hezbollah hit all 4, and this is where things take a serious turn, because the way they did it was not random. It was not luck. It was not a desperate, chaotic ambush by fighters who got fortunate timing. What the forensic analysis of the attack reveals is a level of strategic sophistication that military analysts across the world have been quietly struggling to process in the weeks since. The 2-wave structure of the attack was the key. The first wave was designed with one specific purpose: not to destroy, to overwhelm. Hezbollah launched a saturation of fire against the Israeli column. Rockets, anti-tank missiles, and other munitions were fired in volumes and from angles specifically calculated to force the Trophy active protection systems on the Israeli vehicles to expend their interceptor rounds. Trophy works by firing its own projectiles to destroy incoming threats, but it carries a limited number of interceptors, and if you force it to fire enough of them fast enough, you can drain it. This is not a new concept in military theory. It is called saturation attack. You overwhelm a defense system by forcing it to respond to more threats than it can handle at once. What made Hezbollah's execution remarkable was the precision with which they calibrated the first wave. Not too heavy, not too light. Exactly enough to degrade the protection systems without fully committing their most powerful munitions. The first wave also served a second purpose. It forced Israeli crews to button up inside their vehicles, to close hatches, to reduce their situational awareness, to become more reactive and less proactive. It set the psychological and tactical conditions for what was coming next. And what came next was the second wave. This was when Hezbollah deployed its most advanced anti-tank guided missiles, weapons that had been supplied through Iranian channels, and in some cases represented technology that had been specifically engineered to defeat active protection systems exactly like Trophy. Some analysts believe these included variants of the Kornet missile, an advanced laser-guided weapon with a tandem warhead specifically designed to defeat reactive and active armor. Others have pointed to evidence suggesting even more advanced munitions may have been in play, weapons developed in Iranian military research programs with direct input from engineers who had studied Trophy's technical specifications in detail. The second wave hit vehicles whose active protection systems had already been partially or fully depleted by the first wave. The results were catastrophic. But here is the detail that most news coverage has completely missed. The attack did not just work because of the weapons Hezbollah used, it worked because of where and when they chose to engage. The specific terrain in southern Lebanon where this engagement occurred had been pre-selected by Hezbollah based on months of observation and reconnaissance. They knew the routes Israeli armor would use. They knew the sight lines. They knew exactly where Israeli vehicles would be most exposed and where their own forces could position anti-tank teams at angles that minimized the effectiveness of Israeli counterfire. The firing positions were prepared in advance. Tunnels and hardened underground positions allowed Hezbollah fighters to appear, launch, and disappear before Israeli forces could effectively respond. The timing of the two waves was choreographed to the second, with fighters in multiple positions coordinating through communication systems that had been specifically hardened against Israeli electronic warfare capabilities. This was not an ambush born from desperation. This was a rehearsed military operation, and that distinction matters enormously. Now, let's talk about what happened in the immediate aftermath. Because the images and footage that emerged from that engagement told a story that Israel's military apparatus was initially reluctant to acknowledge. Israeli soldiers were seen evacuating burning vehicles under fire. The speed with which crews had to abandon their machines meant that some vehicles could not be immediately recovered. Images circulated showing Merkava tanks and Namer carriers with catastrophic damage to areas that should have been among the most protected sections of the vehicles. The visual evidence alone was enough to send shockwaves through military communities that had spent years studying Israeli armor performance. But what happened next changed everything in terms of how this engagement would be remembered. Within hours, Hezbollah's media operation released footage of its own. Drone footage, ground-level footage. Documentation of the aftermath designed to be seen not just by Lebanese audiences, but by the entire world, by governments in Tehran and Riyadh and Ankara and Moscow and Washington, by every military planner who needed to update their threat assessments, by every defense contractor who needed to know that the systems they had sold, the systems they were planning to sell, had just been publicly and dramatically defeated. This is where the story stops being just about a single military engagement and starts being about something much larger. Because what Hezbollah demonstrated that day was something that militaries around the world have been quietly wrestling with for years, but rarely discussed publicly. The fundamental tension at the heart of modern armored warfare. You can build a vehicle that is almost impossible to destroy, but almost is the word that gets people killed. And when you advertise your vehicle as indestructible, you have just incentivized every adversary you have to pour resources into finding the one method that works. You have turned defeating your armor into the ultimate proof of concept for any military that wants to demonstrate its capabilities on a global stage. Hezbollah did not just defeat 4 vehicles that day. They produced a marketing document for every state actor and non-state actor that questions whether expensive, sophisticated Western-supplied armor is worth the cost and the political commitment. That message landed in Moscow, it landed in Beijing, it landed in Pyongyang, it landed in Tehran, it landed in every capital where military planners have been watching the slow erosion of the technological gap between advanced Western military systems and the weapons their adversaries have developed. And it raised a question that nobody in those capitals is saying out loud, but everyone is asking in private. If Hezbollah can do this with the resources of a non-state actor, what does the equation look like when a state actor applies the same logic with orders of magnitude more resources? Let's go deeper into what this engagement reveals about the evolution of anti-tank warfare, because this is where the truly alarming implications begin to emerge. For decades, the core assumption of armored warfare doctrine was that technological superiority in armor and protection would always eventually outpace technological developments in anti-tank weaponry. More protection meant more survivability, meant more battlefield dominance. This was the arms race logic that drove the development of composite armor, reactive armor, and eventually active protection systems like Trophy. But what Hezbollah demonstrated, with remarkable sophistication for a non-state actor, is that this assumption may have reached its limits. The saturation attack model that defined the two-wave approach is fundamentally scalable. You do not need to develop a new miracle weapon to defeat an active protection system. You need to be willing to fire enough conventional weapons to exhaust it, then follow up with your most capable rounds against a now vulnerable target. The math is brutally simple. If a trophy system can intercept a finite number of incoming rounds, then any adversary with access to enough rockets and missiles can defeat it, given the right tactics. The question is whether the cost of those rockets and missiles is lower than the cost of the tank you're trying to destroy. In the case of Hezbollah versus Israeli armor, the answer increasingly appears to be yes. A Merkava Mark IV tank costs somewhere between $3 and $4 million. The missiles used in a saturation attack to exhaust its trophy system cost a fraction of that. And the second wave weapon that delivers the killing blow, even if it is an advanced Cornet variant, costs tens of thousands of dollars, not millions. This is the economic logic of modern asymmetric warfare. And it is one of the most destabilizing developments in global military affairs that most people are not paying attention to. But here is what makes this story even more complicated. Because there is another side of this analysis that the dramatic footage and the shock of the engagement tends to obscure. Israeli military forces did not simply absorb this attack and stop operating. They responded. They adapted. And in the hours and days that followed the initial engagement, Israeli air power, artillery, and other ground elements conducted operations against Hezbollah positions throughout the affected area with significant effect. The two-wave attack that destroyed or disabled 4 vehicles did not fundamentally alter the operational balance of the conflict in southern Lebanon in the way that Hezbollah's media presentation was designed to suggest. What it did was demonstrate a tactical capability, a proof of concept. A signal sent not just militarily, but politically and psychologically. And Israel's military establishment, to its credit, understood exactly what kind of signal had been sent. Because the internal response was not denial. The internal response was analysis, what had been learned, what needed to change, how active protection systems needed to be upgraded to handle saturation attacks more effectively, how tactics needed to evolve to reduce the vulnerability of armored columns moving through terrain where this kind of layered ambush was possible. This is the nature of modern military adaptation. You do not win every engagement. The question is whether your institutions learn faster than your adversaries can innovate. But let's step back further. Because the full context of this engagement requires understanding who Hezbollah actually is in 2024 and how they became capable of what the world witnessed. Most Western media coverage of Hezbollah still tends to describe the organization in language that was accurate in the 1990s, but has become dangerously outdated. Hezbollah is described as a terrorist group, as a militant organization, as an Iranian proxy. All of these descriptions contain elements of truth, but none of them captures what Hezbollah has become in terms of military capability. Hezbollah today is a hybrid military force with a standing army structure, a sophisticated logistics and supply network, a command and control architecture that would be the envy of many mid-sized national militaries, and a weapons inventory that includes precision-guided missiles, anti-ship missiles, drone capabilities, and an anti-tank guided missile arsenal that represents some of the most advanced weapons in that category available anywhere in the world. This transformation did not happen overnight. It happened over decades of deliberate investment by Iran, over years of operational experience gained in the Syrian civil war, where Hezbollah fought alongside Syrian government forces against a range of adversaries, and over a consistent analytical approach to studying Israeli military doctrine and capabilities, with the specific goal of finding and exploiting vulnerabilities. The organization that fought Israel in 2006 was formidable. What exists today is categorically different, not just in weapons, in doctrine, in tactical sophistication, in the ability to plan and execute complex multi-phase operations of exactly the kind that destroyed those 4 vehicles. And this evolution has happened while much of the world was focused elsewhere, on Gaza, on Ukraine, on the South China Sea, on the 100 other flashpoints that compete for global attention. What most people don't realize is that the conflict in southern Lebanon has been quietly escalating for years through a series of exchanges that rarely made major international headlines, but that were, in the aggregate, reshaping the military balance along the Israeli-Lebanese border in ways that the events of that engagement made suddenly, dramatically visible. Hezbollah had been conducting what military analysts call gray zone operations: regular cross-border fire, probing attacks, drone overflights, intelligence collection, all designed to stay just below the threshold that would trigger a massive Israeli military response, while simultaneously collecting data on Israeli force dispositions, reaction times, and tactical patterns. Every exchange was a lesson, and Hezbollah was taking notes. Now let's talk about the broader implications of what this engagement means for the conflict as a whole, because the story does not end with burning vehicles and fleeing soldiers. It continues. And where it continues is into territory that should concern anyone who understands how escalation dynamics work in the Middle East. The Israeli military response to this kind of tactical defeat follows a predictable and in some ways unavoidable pattern. You cannot allow a precedent to stand unchallenged. If a non-state actor demonstrates it can defeat your most advanced armor in a coordinated two-wave attack, the political and strategic pressure to respond overwhelmingly is immense. Israeli airstrikes in southern Lebanon intensified in the aftermath of the engagement. Infrastructure associated with Hezbollah logistics and command was targeted. The intensity of cross-border exchanges increased, and the language from Israeli political and military leadership about the situation in the north became notably more explicit about the potential for a larger operation. This is how escalation ladders work. Each rung forces a response that climbs the ladder higher. But here is where the situation becomes genuinely dangerous in a way that goes beyond the immediate tactical picture. Hezbollah's actions in southern Lebanon are not purely autonomous decisions. They operate within a strategic framework coordinated with Iran and, to varying degrees, with other actors in what Iran describes as the axis of resistance. This framework includes Hamas in Gaza, the Houthis in Yemen, and various militia groups in Iraq and Syria. The two-wave attack on Israeli armor in Lebanon did not happen in isolation. It happened in a context where the broader regional conflict that began with the October 7th attacks by Hamas had already dramatically raised the stakes for every actor in the Middle East. Hezbollah's engagement was a deliberate demonstration, not an impulsive response. A signal carefully calibrated within the larger strategic logic of a regional confrontation that is, by some measures, already underway. The question that keeps military analysts awake at night is not whether Hezbollah can defeat Israeli armor in a specific engagement. They have now demonstrated that they can. The question is what the threshold is for Hezbollah deciding to escalate from the current level of cross-border exchange to something that Israel would have no choice but to respond to with the full weight of its military power. And the answer to that question is not known. Not by Israeli intelligence, not by American analysts, not by the diplomats who are frantically working back channels trying to prevent the situation from reaching a point of no return. What is known is that both sides are making calculations that depend on the other side's willingness to blink. Hezbollah calculates that Israel's exposure on multiple fronts, the ongoing commitment in Gaza, the domestic political pressures, the concern about American support for a two-front war, creates a window in which they can continue to demonstrate capability without triggering the full Israeli response. Israel calculates that Hezbollah understands the existential risk of crossing certain thresholds, and that Iran, ultimately, does not want a conflict that would risk the direct military confrontation with Israel and the United States that a full Hezbollah-Israel war could produce. Both calculations may be correct, or one of them may be wrong, in a way that no one discovers until it is too late. And this brings us to the detail in this story that almost nobody is discussing. The 4 vehicles that burned in southern Lebanon that day represented something beyond their individual military value. They represented a message about credibility, and in the architecture of deterrence, credibility is everything. Israel's strategic deterrence has rested for decades on the belief held by its adversaries that the cost of confronting Israel militarily is simply too high. That belief has been sustained by military capability, but also by perception, by the image of Israeli armor rolling through terrain that adversaries could not stop, by the reputation of Israeli intelligence knowing everything, Israeli air power hitting anything, Israeli ground forces operating with a technical and tactical superiority that made direct confrontation prohibitively costly. Every time that image is damaged, even in a single engagement, even in a way that the overall military balance can absorb, the deterrence calculation shifts slightly. And in a region where deterrence is the primary mechanism preventing conflicts from becoming catastrophic wars, even slight shifts matter enormously. Hezbollah did not just burn 4 vehicles that day. They sent a signal to every government in the region watching this conflict, every military planning operation in Tehran and Riyadh and Ankara and beyond, that the image of Israeli military invulnerability has cracks. That those cracks can be found with the right weapons, the right tactics, and the right patience. The response to that signal will define the trajectory of the Middle East's most dangerous conflict arc in ways that are only beginning to become visible. And here's the final layer of this story, the one that ties everything together in a way that most analysis of this engagement has failed to capture. The burning wrecks of those 4 vehicles in southern Lebanon were not just a military event, they were the visual representation of a transformation that has been building for years in the nature of modern warfare itself. The age of the indestructible weapon is over. Not because weapons are no longer powerful, but because the pace of innovation in anti-weapon systems, the global diffusion of advanced military technology through Iranian and Russian and Chinese supply chains, and the tactical sophistication of non-state actors who have had decades to study and adapt to their adversaries' strengths, has closed the gap between the most advanced weapons in the world and the ability to defeat them faster than anyone in the major defense establishments wants to publicly acknowledge. Every military in the world is wrestling with this problem right now. The lessons of Ukraine, where drone warfare and cheap precision munitions have repeatedly defeated expensive Western armor, reinforced a trend that was already visible in Lebanon. The lessons of Yemen, where Houthi drones have disrupted global shipping and demonstrated the reach of what a relatively limited military force can achieve when equipped with the right asymmetric tools. And now the lessons of southern Lebanon, where a non-state actor with sophisticated state backing has demonstrated it can defeat the most protected armored vehicles in the Israeli inventory with a carefully planned 2-wave tactical approach. The defense establishments in Washington and Jerusalem and London and Paris are not ignoring this. The classified briefings happening right now in those capitals are dense with analysis of what happened, what it means, and what needs to change. Billions of dollars in defense research and development will ultimately flow from the lessons of this single engagement as engineers race to find ways to make active protection systems resistant to saturation attacks, to develop new armor configurations, to think differently about how protected vehicles move through contested terrain. But here is the uncomfortable truth that those briefings also contain. Technology develops faster than doctrine. Adversaries adapt faster than bureaucracies can respond. The innovation cycle in military competition is accelerating in ways that make it increasingly difficult for any military power, no matter how well-funded or technologically sophisticated, to maintain a durable advantage through hardware alone. The soldiers who ran from burning Merkava tanks in southern Lebanon were not running because Israeli military technology failed. They were running because the world around that technology had changed. Because Hezbollah had studied every system those vehicles carried, had tested countermeasures, had planned for months, had rehearsed, had calibrated a 2-wave attack that was specifically designed to find and exploit the gap between what those vehicles could withstand and what their active protection systems could handle at once. They were running because in modern warfare, the team that studies harder, prepares longer, and adapts more quickly to the specific battlefield conditions often defeats the team with the more expensive equipment. And that lesson, more than any specific weapon or tactic or piece of footage, is what makes the events in southern Lebanon on that day so significant. Not just for Israel, not just for Hezbollah, not just for Lebanon or Iran or the United States. For every military power in the world that has staked its security on the assumption that enough technology can compensate for the hard, grinding, patient work of understanding your adversary completely. The smoke from those burning vehicles carried a message, and the question now is who is listening and what they do with what they heard. Because in a region